Orchestrated new Western narrative with fresh characters, settings, and plot mechanics. Orchestrated new Western narrative with fresh characters, settings, and plot mechanics. The coin came down on the table so hard the lamp flame jumped, and for a moment, everything in the little sod house went still. That settles the note. The girl rides out with me. A woman's voice broke against it. No. Please, mister. She's all the Lord left us. He had laid more gold on that warped pine table than the whole quarter section was worth, all to buy a starving homesteader's daughter, and to her he was only a silent, weather-burned stranger, come to own her the way a man owns a mule. What she could not have known, what no soul under that low dirt roof could have guessed, was that he had crossed near 300 miles of frozen plain for one single reason. He had never, in 11 hard winters, forgotten her. Out on the high Kansas plain that fall of 1887, the wind never seemed to take a breath. It came down off the Smoky Hill country dry as ash, and went on across the Holloway claim near Sand Coulee, rattling the few cornstalks the grasshoppers had left 2 summers back, worrying the loose shingle on the lean-to, finding every crack in the sod walls and laying a film of grit over the table, the cold stove, the worn Bible. Walt Holloway had broken that ground with his own back and a borrowed plow when Della was a baby, and for a while it had paid. Then came the dry years, one stacked on the next, and the hailstorm that flattened the wheat in 85, and the killing winter that followed, the one folks would spend the rest of their lives calling the Big Die-Up, when cattle froze, standing up against the drift fences for 100 miles. By the fall of 87, the Holloways had 2 bony mules, a milk cow gone dry, and a stack of paper they could not pay. The paper belonged to Horace Pell. Pell ran a land and loan office out at Pueblo, down in Colorado, and he had a gift for finding men at the exact bottom of their luck. He had bought up Walt's note from the bank for pennies and let the interest run like a fever. On that gray Tuesday, he rode out to the Holloway place himself, which was unusual, and that should have told Walt something. He came in a polished black coat with 2 riders flanking him, hard, quiet men with their coats pushed back off their pistols, and he sat his fine bay gelding in the dooryard, as if he already owned the dirt under it, which, in every way that mattered to the law, he soon would. Inside, Della Holloway stood at the cracked window with her hands twisted in her apron. She was 21 that fall, slight from a lean year, with sun-browned skin and a heavy braid of wheat-colored hair down her back, and eyes the pale green of creek ice. She had her mother's quiet and her father's stubbornness, though neither had done the family much good lately. Through the warped glass she watched her father go to Pell hat in hand, an old man's stoop and a body that wasn't old yet. "I'm asking only for the winter, Mr. Pell." Walt's voice came thin through the wall. "Come spring, I'll have a crew through here, You'll have nothing, Walter." Pell didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "You've no seed, no team worth the name, and a wife who can't draw a clean breath. I am not a charity. I hold $310 of your life, and I mean to collect it in money or in land before the snow flies." He paused, and his gaze slid past Walt to the dark square of the window, to the shape of the girl behind it, and something settled into his face that made Della's stomach turn over. "Though there's a kinder road if you'll hear it. I keep a large house in Pueblo. I've need of a girl to mind it, cook, serve, see to my guests. Bind your daughter to me, say 5 years, and I'll burn that note in front of you this minute. She'd be fed, clothed. Better than this." Walt recoiled like he'd been struck. Behind Della, her mother made a small broken sound. Della knew what a man like Pell meant by minding his house, knew it the way a rabbit knows the hawk's shadow without being told. 5 years bound to that man was not work. It was a grave with the lid left off. Her father turned, gray-faced, his mouth working with no answer in him. And that was when they all heard the horse. It came down off the north rise at an easy walk, hooves thudding soft on the dry ground, and every head in the yard turned. The animal was a smoke-gray grullo, big through the chest, with a black mane and a black stripe down its spine, and it carried itself like nothing out there belonged to it. The man on its back was built broad as a doorframe. He wore a long sheepskin coat gone the color of old saddle leather, and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low, and a short-barreled Winchester rode easy across the bow of his saddle. A pale scar ran up out of his collar along the side of his throat. He smelled, when the wind shifted, of horses and wood smoke and cold, open country. Della had never seen him before in her life. She was certain of it. And still something in the set of his shoulders snagged at the back of her mind like a thorn in wool. He brought the Grollo to a stop square between Pell's riders and her trembling father, and the two hired men let their hands drift to their guns without quite touching them. "You've a long ride ahead of you, friend," Pell said, his voice careful now. "This is private business." The stranger didn't look at him. He looked at Walt, and then he looked at the window, and for half a heartbeat his eyes met Della's through the dirty glass, and they were a startling, deep water blue, and there was something in them she could not name, not a threat, but a kind of weight, as if he were holding something heavy and had been holding it a very long time. "Heard the figure," he said. His voice was low and rusted, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. 310. "That is none of your." The man reached into his coat and brought out a small, heavy poke and tossed it underhand. It landed at the gelding's feet with a dull chink, kicking up dust. 400 in gold double eagles," he said. "Army paid me for a string of broke horses out of Fort Garland. Weigh it if your pride needs you to." He let that settle. "Notes cleared. Whatever paper you've got on the girl, that's mine now." Inside the cabin, the floor seemed to drop out from under Della. Her father sank slowly to his knees in the dirt, weeping openly, caught between the deliverance of keeping his ground and the horror of what he was trading for it. Her mother's arms came around her, both of them shaking. "I'm no slaver." The stranger's eyes had gone back to Walt. "But a man living where I live needs a partner who will stand the country, or he doesn't live long. She'll be fed and warm and let alone. That's more than a Pueblo backstair or a frozen dugout will give her, and you know it." Pell's jaw worked. 400 in gold was 400 in gold, and the man across from him had a rifle and the look of someone who'd used one. He swept up the poke, counted nothing, and reined his bay around. "You're a fool, mister, hauling a plains girl into the high rocks before a hard winter," he said. And there was something cold and final under it. "She'll be dead by Christmas." Then he was gone north, his men behind him, dust hanging where they'd been. The stranger swung down. His boots hit the ground, and the whole yard seemed smaller. He crossed to the door, ducked the low frame and filled it. Della pressed back against the cold stove, her mother's hand white-knuckled on her arm. "Get your things," he said, not cruel. "But there was no give in it anywhere. We've a hard 4 days ahead and the high passes won't wait on us. Quarter hour." She did not argue. She had no argument. She'd been sold, the way you'd sell a sack of seed corn against a debt, and she knew it down to the bone. Numbly she gathered 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a knitted shawl gone thin at the elbows, and a tin cup that had been her grandmother's. Her mother kissed her hair and could not speak. Her father could not look at her. And Della Holloway walked out of the only world she had ever owned and up onto a pack horse, into the long shadow of a man whose name she did not yet know. They rode west and then south, off the flat into broken cedar country, and then the land began to stand up on its hind legs and become the Sangre de Cristo Range, the wet mountains piling blue and then white behind. For 3 days they hardly spoke. She rode a steady old roan he'd brought on a lead, and he rode the Grollo ahead and a little to the side, always watching the country, the way some men watch a card table. By day, the silence was the worst of it. She studied him when she dared. The scar on his throat ran up under his ear, old and pale, and his hands on the reins were big and split and burned dark. To her mind, he was something half wild, a thing of the timber that might turn on her without warning. But the wild thing never raised its voice and never raised a hand. At night he did the heavy work without being asked, gathered the wood, struck the fire, shot and dressed a rabbit or a grouse, and gave her the better half. On the 4th evening, as they climbed into a thin cold wind off the snow, she began to shake in her threadbare shawl, her teeth knocking, and she huddled small by the little fire and waited to be despised for her weakness. Instead he stood, and she flinched back, certain now the prize was about to be collected. But he only shrugged out of his big sheepskin coat and laid it over her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, and it held the heat of him, smelled of cedar smoke and horse and cold clean rock. "Keep it close," he said, turning back to the fire in his shirt sleeves against that knife of a wind. "Can't have you freezing on me below the timber." "Thank you, mister." She stopped. She didn't know his name to thank it. He was quiet a moment, looking into the flames. "Calder," he said. "Eben Calder. Eben'll do." On the 5th day they crested a saddle of bare rock and the world opened. Below them, cupped in the high country like water in two hands, lay a green park ringed with black timber, a creek running silver through the middle of it, and a band of mustangs grazing the far slope, manes blowing. Tucked against the trees on the near side stood not the rotted dugout she had braced herself for, but a true cabin. Squared logs notched tight, a roof of split shakes, a stone chimney breathing a thin blue line of smoke. Corrals, a pole barn, a root cellar dug into the bank. A place built by a man who had decided to live, and to live well, in a country that killed careless men by the score. He lifted her down. His hands closed around her waist for half a second, and the strength in them stopped her breath. And then he let go and led her inside. The cabin was warm and swept and orderly. Skillets hung in a row over a black iron range. Braided rugs lay across plank floors. A wide bed in the corner was heaped with thick wool blankets, gray and red. And it was only then, standing in the middle of that clean, quiet room with her little carpet bag against her chest, that the full weight of it found her. There were no Pinkertons here. No mother. No road. No one. For 40 miles of vertical rock, they were alone, more alone than she had ever been in her life. Now, she thought, her heart slamming, now it begins. Eben dropped his saddlebags on the table and went to the stove and fed it, his back to her. Then he straightened and nodded toward the bed. "Take that," he said. "Larders in the corner. Dried elk, biscuit, beans, creek water in the buckets clean." She stared at him. "And you?" He tipped his head toward a low bunk built into the wall by the tack and a pile of hides near the hearth. "Slept rough 10 years, he said. "A soft bed knots my back. Bar the door if it eases you. I've stock to see to before dark." And he went out and pulled the door shut behind him with a soft, careful click. Della stood rooted in the silence, her thoughts scattering like quail. Who was this man? Why throw down a fortune in gold for a girl he'd never laid eyes on, only to leave her be? Slowly, to steady herself, she crossed to the wash basin and scrubbed the trail from her face. And as she dried her hands, her eye caught on the rough mantle over the hearth, on the powder tins and the whetstone and the box of cartridges, and there, set among them like it had wandered in from another life, a small carved thing. She went to it. She lifted it down with 2 fingers, and her breath went out of her all at once. It was a horse. A little running horse whittled from pale pine, legs stretched mid-gallop, mane laid back, the wood worn smooth and dark from years of handling, and the floor of her memory gave way beneath her. She was 9 years old again, out on the Kansas flat with the sky gone the wrong color, that low green-black bruise rolling in from the southwest and the air gone dead still and humming. Her father shouting from the field, too far, and the roar coming. A freight train where there were no tracks. And a boy, a rangy, half-grown boy who'd been passing through with a horse trader's outfit, grabbing her up off her feet and throwing the both of them down into the old root cellar and dragging the slanted door over them while the world tore itself apart overhead. She remembered the noise and the dark and how she'd screamed until her throat bled, and how the boy had held her and talked low and steady the whole time, and when it was over and her ears still rang, he'd pressed something into her shaking hands to quiet her before her people came running. A little horse he'd been whittling on the wagon seat. Then the trader's outfit moved on at dawn, and she never saw him again. She'd lost the horse that same winter when the prairie burned. Della stood holding the carving, her heart going hard and slow. It couldn't be. That boy had ridden out of her life 16 years, gone and into the territories, and never come back. The door opened on a gust of cold, and Eben came in stamping snow. It had begun to fall, fine and sifting, and shut it against the rising wind and through the bar. He shook the white from his coat and turned, and saw her standing by the hearth with her hand held open, the little horse in her palm. For the first time since the Holloway dooryard, the unmovable man faltered. "The cellar," she said, and her voice came out a thread. "The twister. Outside Ellsworth. I was 9. The fire popped into the stillness. You whittled this on a wagon seat and put it in my hand so I'd stop screaming." He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't turn away. He hung his coat on its peg, slow as an old man, and went to the basin and threw cold water on his face, and when he turned back his voice had dropped low and rough as creek gravel. "I was 14, he said, riding with a horse trader named Sweeney, working my way west. My folks had died on the trail the year before. Fever took my mother and my sister both inside a week down on the Republican, and my father after, his own way. I had nobody, so I went where there wasn't anybody." He looked at his split hands. "Then the storm came up while we were buying mules off your daddy, and I saw you out in it, and I did the only thing a body could." "You held me," she whispered. The pieces of her whole life were turning and locking into a shape she'd never seen. "You stayed with me, and then you were gone." Sweeney pulled out at first light. "I went on into the high country with the horses, and I learned to live up there. A man doesn't have to explain himself to a mountain." He was quiet a moment. "I came down to Walsenburg this fall for salt and shells. Saw you on the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile, helping your mother to the wagon. Knew the braid. Knew those eyes before I knew anything else." His jaw tightened. "Heard Pell that same night in the saloon, talking loud about the Holloway note. Heard what he meant to do with the daughter. And I knew I couldn't ride back up into those rocks and leave you to it." The tears came hot and sudden, and Della did not try to stop them, because all at once she understood. He had not bought a slave. He had bought, with everything he had in the world, her freedom, and he had asked nothing back. "You spent all of it," she said, the size of it breaking over her. "It was only gold," he said simply, and crossed to her and folded her fingers gently shut around the little horse. "Yours from the start, that. You hang on to it." Something changed in that cabin that night, and it never changed back. As the storm walled them in and the snow piled to the windowsills and then above them, Della and Eben fell into the close rhythm of two people keeping each other alive in a place that wanted them dead. He taught her to gentle the young horses with a slow hand and a low voice. Taught her to read snow and weather and sign. Taught her, patient as a man can be, to load and aim and fire the Winchester, his big hand steady over hers. "Breathe it out. Let it sit in the notch. Don't snatch at it." And she gave him back things he'd gone without for 10 years. She baked sweet biscuit with their flour and read aloud from her mother's Bible by the fire, and she made him talk, drew the stories out of him a little at a time. The wolf packs, the spring colts, the way the light came up pink off the snowfields in the morning. The terror she'd carried up the mountain wore away day by day, and something warmer grew up under it that she had no name for. But the high country does not forgive a soft season, and it took its toll near the bottom of January when the cold sank to 40 below and held there for a week, and drove the game down out of the heights. One black midnight, the horses went off in the corral screaming, slamming the rails. Eben was out of his bunk and into his coat with a lantern and the sharps before Della was fully awake. "Bar behind me," he said, and went out into the dark and the blowing snow. She crowded to the window and scraped the frost with her nail. By the swinging yellow of the lantern she saw them, wolves, 4 or 5, gaunt as fence rails and crazed with hunger, slashing at the horses through the rails. Even fired once and a shape dropped. The pack scattered and circled. Then one of the young horses reared and came down wrong on the ice, and as Eben lunged to drive the wolves off the fallen colt, the big Grollo spooked into him, and his boot went under and the lantern flew, and the whole yard went black. A single shot, a tearing, dragging sound, a heavy fall, then nothing but the wind. Eben. She tore at the bar with both hands, snatched a burning stick from the stove, and ran out into snow past her knees in her nightdress. She found him 20 steps from the corral. 2 wolves lay dead. He was down under the weight of the colt, which had rolled across his leg in its thrashing, and one of the wolves had got to him before he killed it, a long, deep tear up the meat of his thigh, and the leg itself bent wrong below the knee, soaking dark into the snow. Panic came up in her like a flood, and then, somewhere under it, the cold hard lessons of that winter took hold. With strength she did not know. She heaved the colt off him, and got her shoulder under his arm and dragged him, foot by bleeding foot, back across the yard, up over the sill, into the warm. For 3 days a fever rode him. She did not sleep. She melted snow for clean water, and packed the wound with a poultice of pitch and dry yarrow he kept in a tin, and splinted the leg straight as she could, and when the chill shook him, she lay against him and gave him her own heat. And somewhere in the gray middle of the 3rd night, listening to him breathe, watching his ruined leg, She stopped lying to herself. She was not a girl who'd been bought. She was a woman in love, all the way down, with the man who had twice now stood between her and dying. He mended. The leg knit crooked and left him a limp he'd carry to the grave, and the long scar on his thigh joined the one on his throat. By the time the eaves began to drip in March, they no longer slept on two sides of the room. They were husband and wife in the only way the mountains recognized, and the only way that counted. It was a bright, raw morning in early spring when it came apart. Della was pinning wash to a line strung between two pines when she heard a dry stick crack, not down in the timber, but up along the ridge that overlooked the cabin. She stilled. Eben was a mile off down at the creek, pulling the last of the winter's deadfall. She shaded her eyes and looked up at the tree line, and her blood went to water. 4 riders were picking their way down the muddy switchback. Long dusters, low hats, gun belts heavy at the hip, and riding point with a livid scar through one eyebrow was one of the 2 hard men who had flanked Horace Pell in her father's dooryard. They were not here for her. Pell had never let the gold go. He'd taken his 400, waited out the snows, and sent men up to take back the rest, and whatever else they cared to take. Della dropped the wet shirt in the mud and ran. She threw herself through the door, and her hands found the Winchester over the mantel and a fistful of brass from the box, and she dropped the bar just as hooves came pounding into the dooryard. "Calder," a rough voice bawled. The scarred man, she would learn his name, was Rance Mullen. "We know the mountain man's whelped himself a wife. Open up, hand out the poke, and maybe we leave the both of you breathing." She set her back to the wall, breathing shallow, and levered around into the chamber the way he'd taught her. "Eben's up the ridge," she called, dropping her voice hard and flat. "He's got a sharps trained on the back of your neck right now. You ride out. You might live to see it." A low, ugly laugh. "That's the Little Plains hen," Mullen said to his men. "Pell said she was a pretty one. He's off hunting. Kick it in, boys. We'll find the gold and have ourselves a visit before the trapper gets home." A boot slammed the door. The hinges groaned. The bar held. Della moved to the side window, smashed the glass out with the rifle butt, laid the barrel across the sill. A man with a heavy beard was rearing back to kick again. She breathed out. She let the front sight sit on him. She squeezed. The rifle roared and filled the room with smoke, and the bearded man spun screaming into the mud, clutching his shoulder. The yard came apart, horses plunging, men cursing, pistols banging at the cabin wild and blind. Lead thudded into the thick logs and chewed the window frame and sang off the iron stove. Della dropped flat, coughing in the smoke, and threw the lever and came up again. "Burn it," Mullen was shrieking. "Get pitch off the trees and burn the witch out." Her heart stopped. The shakes were dry as tinder. A fire against them, and she was cooked in her own house. She crawled for the front window to get an angle on Mullen before he could strike a light, and then a sound came rolling down off the timber that froze every man in the yard where he stood. A deep, flat boom, more felt than heard, that shook the cold air. The man bending to a torch was flung off his feet and back into the snow with a fist-sized hole punched clean through him. At the edge of the trees, leaning into the smoking sharps, stood Eben. He'd heard the crack of her Winchester clear down at the creek and come up the back of the ridge at a dead run on that ruined leg. Mullen wheeled and fired twice, but a pistol was nothing at that range, and Eben was already breaking the breech, the long brass shell flipping into the mud, sliding home another finger-sized cartridge. The remaining 2 had seen enough. They hauled their horses around and ran for the pass, the wounded one swaying in the saddle. Eben let them go. He dropped the rifle in the mud and broke for the cabin instead. "Della." She threw back the bar, and the door swung wide, and she stood there black with soot and powder. Glass in her hair, the Winchester still in her fist. He hit the steps and swept her up against his chest so hard the breath left her, and buried his face in her hair, and the giant scarred man shook like a sapling. "I'm all right," she said fierce into his collar, her arms locked around his neck. "I did what you taught me. I'm all right." He pulled back to look at her, his thumbs wiping soot from under her eyes, and there was nothing left in his face of the cold stranger from the dooryard, nothing at all but a raw and bottomless devotion. "Pell won't quit," he said low. "Now he knows the trail. He'll come back with an army. What neither of them yet understood was just how much Pell stood to gain. Down in the valleys, the wheels had been turning all winter. A surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande had quietly cored the worthless Holloway ground the autumn before and struck a seam of coal 8 feet thick and miles long, the kind of find that built towns and bought senators, with the railroad already laying iron toward Wolzenberg to feed it. Pell had learned of it, but his scheme had run onto a rock he hadn't counted on. The hard winter had taken both Walt and Nan Holloway, gone within a week of each other of the lung fever in a Pueblo charity ward, and under the plain law of the land the deed had passed to their only living kin. Della Holloway, who did not know it, was the sole heir to a fortune that could buy half of Huerfano County. Pell's labor contract was so much waste paper now. To take the coal he needed 2 things: Della dead and her name forged onto a backdated bill of sale. So they did not wait for the army to find them. That very week, Eben and Della packed what the mules could carry and climbed higher, up past the last twisted timber and into a hanging basin he called the Cradle, a green secret bowl below the bare peaks that a man could not find unless he already knew the way in. There they built a rougher, freer life through the warm months. Della traded calico for buckskin, learned to track elk across shale and to put a ball through a tin at 200 yards, and the frightened girl from San Coulee was gone for good, hammered into something harder and surer by the high cold air. The reckoning came on a blinding clear afternoon at the back end of summer, near a place Eben called Chute, a narrow rock corridor where the only trail into the basin pinched down to single file between a sheer wall and a long drop, with the whole Mustang band summering in the meadow just above it. Eben was skinning out a deer when the wrong sound came up the canyon. Shod hooves, iron on stone, a lot of them. He came in fast and put the Winchester and a belt of brass in Della's hands. "Riders," he said. "Near a dozen, coming up the chute, and they've packed themselves into it like shells in a tube." She didn't waste a breath on fear. She took the little carved horse off the shelf and slid it into her pocket and followed him up to the rim above the corridor. Below, strung out helpless on that thread of trail, came the posse, and dead center of it, sweating through a city coat on a borrowed horse, rode Horace Pell. Eben didn't lift his sights to the men. He moved instead to the upper end of the meadow, to the brush gate of the natural pocket where the wild band stood watching the commotion with their ears pinned and their nostrils wide, already half spooked by the strangers in their country. Della understood, and her heart climbed into her throat. "Calder!" Pell's voice came thin off the walls. "There's nowhere left to run, you hear? Send the girl down. She puts her hand to one paper and you ride off a free man. She's sitting on a coal seam worth $1 million, and she's too stupid to know it." Della's breath caught. The dead ground that had starved her family was a fortune all along. "She's not for sale, Pell," Eben called, his hand on the gate. "And she's not signing anything you ever touched. Turn that string around." "Kill them," Pell screamed, and yanked a pistol, and his men began clawing rifles out of their boots in the cramped trail. They never got them clear. Eben threw the gate wide and fired the sharps once, flat into the rock, just over the band, and that booming roar in that close country was all it took. 40 head of half-wild mountain horses broke at once and poured down the only path open to them, which was the chute, a thundering brown and gray flood of muscle and iron hooves, funneling straight into Pell's strung-out men. There was no room to turn, no room to climb. The saddle horses panicked and bolted into the stampede and were swept up in it. Men were spilled screaming off the edge or trampled into the stone, the whole canyon shaking and roaring and gone white with dust. Eben moved along the rim quick and cold, the Winchester barking, taking the 2 gun hands who clawed their way up out of the chaos with rifles still in their fists. Della fired beside him, steady as flint, and a man who'd drawn a bead on her husband's back went down off his horse and did not get up. When the dust began to drift and settle, the chute was a graveyard. Of the dozen who'd ridden up, nothing moved but a single riderless horse limping away down the slope. And below the rim, snagged against a boulder where the flood had thrown him, lay Horace Pell, his fine coat torn half off him, his schemes and his coal and his backdated paper all gone to nothing under the hooves of the wild horses he'd never bothered to fear. Eben stood and ejected the long brass shell, and it rang faintly on the stone. He looked at her across the ruined trail. "That seems yours, Della," he said. and his scarred face gave nothing away. We could dig out a deed, find a square judge in Pueblo. You could be the richest woman in Colorado before the first snow. Della stood at the rim a long while, with the dust settling and the wind coming clean and cold off the peaks. She thought of her father weeping in the dirt, and her mother's cough in the dark, and the charity ward in Pueblo where the two of them had died poor and far from their own ground while a fortune slept under the dirt they'd broken their backs on. She thought of the other San Cuis, all the worn-out families Pell had bled. Her hand found the little carved horse in her pocket and closed around the smooth, worn wood of it. "No," she said slowly, "not the way you mean." She turned to him, and her voice came steady and sure. "I'll file it, in my own name, so no Pell that ever lived can take it off the next family that's down on their luck. I'll lease the coal honest and small, and what comes off it goes back down the mountain, to the ones he ruined, to the church and the schoolhouse in Walsenburg, to my father's name on a stone he never got." She looked out over the basin, the green meadow, the bare bright peaks beyond. "But the rest stays in the ground and we stay up here. I had nothing but a tin cup and a debt when you laid that gold on the table, and I've been richer every day since for not 1 ounce of it." A slow, proud warmth came up in Eben Calder's eyes. The cold stranger gone for good. He held out his big split hand and she put hers in it, and the two of them turned their backs on the wreck below and walked up into the high green cradle of the mountains, the woman he had carried in his heart for 16 winters and never once let go, and the little wooden horse riding, warm and worn in her pocket all the way home. I keep coming back to that little carved horse, the one worn smooth from a child's hands in a man's pocket over 16 long winters. It's such a small thing to carry the whole weight of a life. But that's how it usually works, isn't it? The big moments turn on something you'd never notice if you weren't paying attention. What strikes me most is how nothing in this story happened by accident. Eben didn't ride 300 miles on a whim. He laid down every dollar he had on Walt Holloway's table because, years before, a half-grown boy with nothing to his name had decided that a stranger's drowning child was worth wading into a storm for. He didn't do it for thanks. He did it because it was the right thing in front of him, and a man who builds that habit young carries it into everything after. That quiet decency is what came back around when Della needed it most. We don't always get to see our own kindnesses returned to us. He did. And Della, she could have stayed the frightened girl from San Cooley. Plenty of people would have. But she watched, and she learned. She learned to read the snow and steady a rifle and split a wound clean. And when Rance Mullen came kicking at that door, it wasn't luck that saved her. It was every lesson she'd swallowed her pride to take. The mind that pays attention, that asks how a thing works instead of just fearing it, is a mind that keeps you alive. Hers did. But knowing and meaning well aren't enough on their own. You have to be able to stand the cold. When that horse rolled across Eben's leg and the wolves were still circling, Della didn't have the luxury of falling apart. She dragged a man twice her size through the snow and sat up 3 nights with a fever that might have killed him. And she did it because something in her refused to quit. That's the part nobody can hand you. You build it one hard night at a time, and you don't know you have it until the night comes. The thing I admire most is what she did at the very end. She had a fortune under that dirt, and every reason to grab it with both hands after the way the world had treated her. Instead, she filed the claim so no Horace Pell could ever do to another family what was done to hers, sent the money down to the people he'd ruined, and went back up the mountain with the 10 cups worth of belongings, and the only thing she'd ever really wanted. She didn't reject the gold out of pride. She'd just learned what it was actually for. That's what stays with me. Be the kind of person whose old kindnesses come home. Keep learning, even when you're scared, and when the long cold night comes, refuse to quit.